Welcome back, Disruptor, to another episode of the Liberation Lab podcast, insights and interviews for the disruptive educator. At the time of this recording, I am enjoying the last vestiges of fall break. But as I think through all the things that are going on and how best to challenge and push us forward, I want to dive into, in this episode, some non-negotiables that you need in order to be an effective educator. Some non-negotiables. So I want to start this way. In order for us to really get a picture of where things are currently, we must take a look back, right? When we look at the U.S. educational system, and we look at it from a educational justice lens, we know that education is almost the tale of two cities, the tale of two extremes, where your zip code significantly impacts your measures for success. We have the persistence of the opportunity gap, the disparities in educational outcomes among different racial and socioeconomic groups. We have the continued vestiges of Brown versus the Board of Education prevalent in low income areas. And let me be careful here, because even when I say low income, it may present it like it's the problem of the people in that location, but this is a intentional, calculated exploitation of people groups in these yet to be United States of America. They have fewer resources, often less experienced teachers, and larger class sizes. All the things that make it harder to teach Black and brown youth. And so when we think about this year, maybe you're where I am. As I sit here to record this episode, there are moments where I struggle to find hope. And here's what I mean. I badly want to help disrupt, change, improve, dismantle, all the words, this oppressive system of schooling that we know exists. Yet I have to work in a system that I know actively oppresses, and struggle with being complicit in said system, even though I'm fighting against said system. And so when we're talking about the historical picture, I think it gives us a call forward. How can we be the educators that we need to be unless we know the larger story that we're being written into? We know that the data is there, right? Equitable access to educational resources, opportunities for all students, regardless of their race, socioeconomic status, background, disparities in funding, accountability in funding, because we all know that there are some schools that get money, but where does that money go? Teacher quality, educational facilities. And we know this to be true because in a capitalistic society, the way that we show that we care is when there's a dollar sign attached to that thing. We know that there is a massive issue on who gets excluded from opportunity in education. When we look at school discipline practices, all students of color, particularly students who look like me, are experiencing disproportionately high rates of suspension and exclusion. The anti-Blackness that pervades education is real. And education becomes something that we have to survive, that we don't thrive in. We, quite frankly, would rather push out perceived problems than do the work to heal and restore. And then on top of that, the disproportionate numbers of Black and brown children recommended for special education. And again, this is calculated. When the funding formulas are tweaked to give more money to the students who are in that programming and exclude them from testing data, what do you think is going to happen when we have people who fail to understand the students that they punish? We'll say, oh, well, they're not learning. Something must be wrong with them. Not something must be wrong with the teaching, the education, the curriculum, the lack of representation. No, something's wrong with them. So often the ask of students is to assimilate into the dominant culture, and only the ones that acquiesce can succeed. And so, how is it that we can move forward? What is it that we need to do, despite all we're experiencing? What are the non-negotiables? And listen, this isn't an exhaustive list, but there's just some things that I'm reflecting on in my practice that I hope pushes you forward as well. The first thing that I think that we must do to be highly effective, and this isn't going to be measured on Danielson or your TNTP rubrics, but we need to have a commitment to radical humility. There is a habit, if you will, in education, where we will gladly point to ourselves when the data shares good news: higher test scores, graduation, um, improvements in grading, our grades. We'll point to ourselves and say, yeah, I worked really hard. I did the work necessary to help my students get to that next level. But we'll quickly point away from ourselves when the data tells a different story. Suddenly, the outside world is the reason that our children aren't succeeding. Now, I hear you, Bobby. You don't know the students I teach. Bobby, you you don't understand. I'm not saying that external factors don't impact our children, but I am saying that we have to have the Mulan effect. Anybody that knows me knows that my favorite Disney movie is Mulan. And Mulan really um, pushes back against misogyny, gender roles, sexism, and all the things. And one of the ways that it does that is Mulan is um, she cuts her hair, pretends to be a man by the name of Ping, and as a result, she enlists into the army. They're going to go fight the Hun. And the general who's in charge of the troops is telling them that he is going to make a man out of them. She goes through the training. She is horrible at first. And there's this one challenge that every single officer has to go through, and that is you have to hold these two massive plated weights, and you have to get to the top of this pole. It is the only way that you prove your manhood. Well, Milan, being the intelligent woman she is, says if I take these weights and I string them together around the pole, they will act as a counterbalance to push me, propel me to the heights I'm trying to ascend to. She takes the left one, takes the right one, wraps it around the pole, pulls herself up, and gets to the top of this obstacle. In other words, two competing realities. Yes, there are external factors affecting my children. And yes, I can be a better educator. If we took those things and wrapped them around the obstacle in front of us, maybe, just maybe, we could climb and ascend to better outcomes for our students. Use them as a counterbalance. That's the Milan effect, where we hold those two competing realities in tension. If you've been listening for a while, you know that I started in Camden, New Jersey. It was voted the most dangerous city to live in, one of the poorest. And I went in those years and I said I was going to, quote, save these children. I never said it in those words, but that was the reality. It was my inflated sense of self, my bias, that was the main obstacles I had to get over in order to really teach these kids. I was challenged by actually having proximity to some of the most brilliant and hardworking students I've had the honor of teaching. And they taught me that humility will take me much further than believing that I had all the answers. See, when I first started, I needed to be the sage on the stage. They needed to know that I knew the answers. I knew how to teach. And more, uh, that is due more so to the fact that I was teaching to prove my own worth rather than teaching to empower them. It was more about me. I needed to be seen. I needed my ego assuaged. I needed the applause. I needed to see that the data mattered. See what radical humility will do is get you off the driver's seat. Or let me say it this way, radical humility will get you off of the throne. You don't need to be centered in everything. That's part of the problem in education. That does not mean that teachers don't need the support, teachers don't need the attention. But at the end of the day, we are public servants to students. And I think that we forget that sometimes, particularly when it comes to um, how we punish and push out our students. Without the students, we don't have a job. And education is a right, not a privilege. And it would behoove us as educators to commit to a radical humility that says, I don't have it all figured out and I can always grow. One of the things that really burns me up about education is that when we have teachers who have 20 years and 30 years, and I've been doing this for a long time, they get set in their ways and feel like they can't grow, learn, adapt, change. And they tout the fact that they have been an educator for X amount of years as a reason to show their expertise. Yet, if you dig deeper into some of that data, you realize that they've been spending 20 plus years failing students over and over and over again. Don't tell me how many years you've been in. Tell me how you've grown since you started. So we must be committed to radical humility, but we also must push ourselves to be culturally proficient. Now, when I say that, I am not telling you that you need to have intimate knowledge about every one of the 25 students that's in your classroom, about their culture. And when we typically think culture, we think shallow culture. We stop at cuisines and customs, flags that represent the countries. And we say, nope, we're celebrating this month. But I love what Zaretta Hammond, author of the book Culture, Responsive Teaching in the Brain, by the way, you need to read that book if you haven't. She says it this way: a big myth is that it's about motivating students of color by mentioning cultural facts and naming famous people of color. Culturally responsive teaching is not just about motivating disengaged students. It's about rebuilding trust with them through a learning partnership, using that rapport and trust to get permission from students to push them into their zone of proximal development. Oh man, I love that. I love that she uses the language of partnership. It is using collectivist principles. Zaretta Hammond also points out that to use the analogy, when a bee is confused, it returns to the hive to get instructions. That in loving community, we should be framing our classrooms just like that, to have a learning partnership where it isn't just about what you know and what you're trying to do and the pacing guide and all of the other things that pressure us into this production factory called the classroom. It is about using these collectivist principles, setting expectations, getting permission. Oh, that's really good. And the reason that it's really good is because it requires you to have to put a level of respect on the student. It requires you to have to put yourself in a position where you have to consider their needs, how they learn. And that's the beauty of teaching. It is when something starts to click, not because I taught it a certain way or I said it a different way. That's good. But it starts to click because I have their investment and their trust now. And we're journeying together. Where learning becomes an aha moment for us all, where their expertise teaches me something. You see, it's moving from this, like I said, the sage on the stage to the role of a facilitator. Man, I'm a tour guide. I'm pointing out these things and these artifacts on their journey to learning and growth. And that's what makes me culturally responsive. So when I say culturally proficient, the push is that we don't stop at being competent. Competency means, oh, I have a knowledge, but it doesn't mean I'm necessarily doing anything with it. Proficiency means I am actually using the information that I've gained to impact the learners in my classroom. So we must be radically humble, commit to radical humility. We must be culturally proficient, but we also have to have a critical consciousness. At the time of this recording, there is a polarizing discussion happening. And that is, if I were to say free Palestine, there are folks who would say that I am being anti Semitic, that our binary thinking, this or that the inability of us to have two things be true at the same time has put us in such a state where, oh, well, teachers are making the conscious choice not to mention anything. Matter of fact, I literally just saw a video where a teacher decided it was a principal decided that they would remove a kid from a online learning space because they have the Palestinian flag. And they said, we want all students to feel included. What is excluding anybody about representing a country, putting a flag up? And then she says, well, this isn't a political thing, but they're making it political by ostracizing a group of people for a flag. God help me. And not a flag that represents some racist ideology or has some underpinnings. No, a flag of a country. And so we must establish a critical consciousness. Education has kind of buried their head in the sand when it comes to the events in the real world. We make the classroom this mythical place that students journey to, and they'll learn here in this land of Oz, but we can ignore what they're going through, or what they're experiencing, or what they're learning, or what they're questioning. If you are silent about the world around your students, it doesn't stop them from questioning. But if you are an effective educator, you'll encourage critical thinking. You'll engage with students in discussions about social issues. You'll help them analyze and challenge inequities, inequalities, stereotypes, injustices. Here's another thing. The antiquated belief that students should be motivated because it's their grade needs to die. The way we've weaponized grading, the way that we have used grades as this subjective measure of intelligence. And listen, I'm not above it. When I started, I used to teach concepts and believe that a student should care because it's their grade. But think about the hubris in that statement. It is only when I made math relevant to their daily lives that I saw my students come alive and take learning to the next level because they were invested. And so we have to establish a critical consciousness that makes connections to the real world with what we're teaching in the classroom, that makes learning exist beyond the four walls of your classroom. Critical consciousness says, yeah, I'm reading a text that has connections about empathy or connections about understanding, and then we pause and say, okay, well, how does this relate? And you allow your students to bring up things like what's happening between Israel and Palestine, what's happening in Gaza, and the deep nuance that exists. When we say that teaching is not political, yet Whole campaigns are run about getting certain people in office. The Board of Education, you have to vote people into office. There are political pundits who challenge what belongs and what doesn't belong in education. Teaching has always and will continue to be political. Does that mean that you have to be a quote unquote Democrat or quote unquote Republican or libertarian? No. It means that you must establish a critical consciousness that says who's included, who's excluded, why? What voices are centered in this text? What voices are centered on this page? Whose faces do you see? Whose faces do you not see? Why? You teach them critical thinking that takes them beyond centering themselves or the people that look like them. And I mean this for every single people group. So we must commit to radical humility. We must be culturally proficient. We must establish a critical consciousness. But man, if we don't refine our teaching practices, our pedagogy, if you are the teacher who has a set curriculum and you replay your greatest hits, it is it is interesting to think about that, and then now think about this time of season that's become like a thing, right? Where right after Halloween, we get all the videos, all the things about Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas. And that hit continues to play every single year around the same time. She says she's unfrozen and now she's ready to go. It's that time of year again. And I think that is akin to what teachers do when they take the same thing that they've done for years and they replay it year after year after year. They take their greatest hits on repeat instead of considering the positionality that they might have in the classroom, the students in the classroom, what's going on in and outside, what's happening, what's the cultural context in which they are embedded, what's the history of the community. They don't apply various teaching strategies. We talk about differentiated instruction, but we don't really do it. Project-based learning, how we actually use formative assessment in a way that helps move things forward, the feedback we give students. Like if you're writing good job, but that's it. Listen, I'm the first one to advocate for relationship building and empathy, but if you have all of that, yet you fail to grow in your teaching methods, you are committing educational malpractice. If your students aren't learning and growing, we are failing. But with that, man, we got to have some emotional intelligence. This capitalistic system of schooling continues to produce or continues to demand that we produce and robs us of humanity. Emotional intelligence means that we are attuned. We have the right frequency of our students' emotions. It means showing empathy and providing emotional support. And here's the rub with that. Too many educators are in classrooms failing to regulate their own emotions but demanding that students do. We have higher expectations of students than we do for ourselves. We can't overlook that this skill impacts us personally. We must do the internal work necessary to have the external impact that we desire. I was teaching a class one day. I was teaching a middle school math class. I was actually in Trenton at the time. And we were going through this lesson, and I had a student who was on my basketball team, student who I coach, a student who I deeply care about to this day. Student reminded me of me in so many different ways. Young black male. He's charismatic. He was funny. But for some reason today, he was just an off day. We were teaching a lesson. Me and my co-teacher were co-teaching, and this student's in the back of the classroom. He has his head down. I try to get him engaged, ask him what's going on, get curious. But when he decides to pick his head up, the next thing he decides to do is disrupt the lesson, crack jokes. People are literally almost falling out of their seats at the jokes he's cracking. He's really funny and he knows it. Dangerous combination. And so as we are um, engaging and he's disrupting, I asked him to step into the hallway so we can talk. My co-teacher takes over the lesson. I step into the hallway and we proceed to engage in a conversation. Now, here's the thing. I grew up in a military household. My grandfather was retired, served in Vietnam. Sir, yes, sir. No, sir. Look me in my eyes when you're talking to me, son. Like those kind of things. And so for me, that was how I viewed respect. Look me in my eyes. And I demanded that this student do the same thing. Why? Because that's how I was raised. I was writing my own autobiography by looking at this student's actions and judging them as respectful or disrespectful. When to the student's perspective, he wasn't looking at me because there was shame attached to what had just happened in the classroom. He knew he was wrong and he knew he had disappointed me. But by demanding that he engage with me in a manner that I felt like was necessary, I put him in a position where he had no choice but to be defensive. So, fast forward the story, we have a discussion that goes nowhere. And you know what I had to do? I had to go back and apologize to that student because I demanded something out of him that didn't serve him, that didn't serve the conversation, that didn't move the needle whatsoever. I lacked emotional intelligence in that moment. And unfortunately, what I just said is on repeat in classrooms all throughout our nation. Emotional intelligence will put us in position to be a student of our students, where we learn them, learn what makes them tick, learn how they engage. What are the things that happen when they feel frustrated, when they feel like things aren't going right? So, when we talk about what it means to be a highly effective educator, there are many things that we could add to this list, but I suggest that these 5 are necessary for us to be able to move the needle forward. And I would suggest that in this time, in this season of education, these 5 are non-negotiable. The disruption that we seek to the things that are affecting us are hinged on, are dependent upon the disruption that we are willing to do within ourselves. What I mean is, you have been trained to approach education a certain way, and your teacher prep program has probably, I'm going to say, has left you ill prepared to deal with students in a way that honors their humanity while still honoring yours. So, here's where our challenge is. Alone, you can be excellent. But together, we can be exemplary. In loving community, rally around folks that are moving in the same trajectory, challenge each other, push each other. Let's do it because kids deserve it. So, listeners, disruptors, I hope you're doing well. I hope this year of education is your best yet. And I'm glad that you are still fighting this fight because our kids need it. Till next time, till next week, let's keep pushing.